Hi, everyone. This is a summary. This is kind of a retelling, a redoing of the last class, which I tried to have on Facebook, streaming on Facebook Live, and it was a tremendous disaster because I couldn't stream on Facebook Live, and it bugged my live people. So right now, everyone who missed things on Facebook Live, I'm recording this video for you. Also, if you were at the live class and you just kind of want a refresher, this is also going to be a slightly more structured approach because I'm not going to be, people won't be asking questions in the middle. So that's what I'm going to do. So what are we talking about? Now we're going to, it's the introduction to Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. We're going to talk about their place in Treasar, in the 12 minor prophets. Just as a reminder, they're not minor because they're not important. In fact, they're considered very important. If you look at our tefillot, at our prayers, you'll see that they're very heavy on, we've got a lot of quotes from Treasar, from the 12 short prophets, and they're pretty important. We have our first book prophets there, we have our last book prophets there, and our last book prophets are what this class is about: Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay, so they have a special place in the book of the 12, right? The 12 minor prophets, in that they finish off the book. In general, Treasar it has a kind of a chronological order, and then there are books where we don't have a chronology, and they're kind of placed usually in places where, at least in Tanakh, in the Masoretic Bible, where there's kind of a linguistic connection between that book and the book before and the book after. So that's why Yoel is placed between Hosea and Amos, because it has linguistic connections to each. Yoel, in fact, I'll mention Yoel again later because Yoel is interesting. We don't have a date for Yoel. And because there's no date for Yoel, it can't be placed chronologically, and so it's placed where it is. Ovadia is another book that we don't have a real chronology for. And in fact, if you look at the difference in the order of the Treasar in the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation that's based on the Alexandrian Bible, right? And our Masoretic text, right, our Tanakh. So it's the order of the Treasar is mostly the same, but Yoel and Micha kind of move around in the order. Now we have, again, traditionally, from the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, why are they all in one scroll? I mean, we have their variety of different topics. They're even different, like Yonah is actually not a book prophet, it's a story, right? It's not a book of prophecy. It's a story, the book of Yonah. So all these kind of books are just kind of placed together. What's the connection? Why are they all together? And the answer is because they're so short that if they were each written individually, we would lose them, right? Now, in fact, the tradition of writing these specific books together goes way back. We can see already at Qumran and in Nachal Chever, we have fragments with the end of one and the beginning of another. So we know that already in the Second Temple period, these were being written together. And again, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi end these books, but they don't just end the books of the Treasar. They don't just end the books of the 12 minor prophets. They end book prophecy. They're our last book prophets. What do I mean when I say book prophets? I mean that these are not prophets that are, let's say, walking around. These are prophets and doing miracles, let's say. These are prophets that we have their sayings collected in a book. All right. So, for example, Elisha and Eliyahu are not book prophets. We don't have a book of the sayings of Elisha. We don't have a book of the prophecies of Eliyahu. We have the book of Kings, which has the stories of the miracles that Elisha and Eliyahu did, and also some of their prophecies, their very specific prophecies regarding, ruling and kings, things like that, right? But we don't have a book of prophecy like we have the book of Yeshayahu, right? We don't have, so Amos, however, Amos was a short book. That is a book prophet. We have a book of his prophecy. Yirmiyahu, also a book prophet, even though his book includes stories about him, about the stuff he did, right, and things that happened to him. Okay, would you call Yonah a book prophet? you have a book that's called Yonah, but it's not really a book of his sayings. It's a book of a story of what happened to Yonah. So normally we wouldn't call him a book prophet. Okay, so our final prophets in that sense are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And in fact, the fact that there are final prophets is part of how traditionally the period of the return to Zion is considered the end of, you could say, divine inspiration, of direct divine inspiration. What do I mean, and why is this important? The answer is that after that period, after the period of return to Zion, it seems to be that anyone who comes up and says, I'm a prophet, is not taken seriously. Right? Now, I'm filling in a little bit here because we have a big gap, right? We have a gap between the return to Zion and our first books, what we call Second Temple literature. Like our earliest piece of Second Temple literature that's preserved after the books of Return to Zion. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Well, yeah, you can say that. There are books in the Hebrew Bible itself which are considered academically, considered by scholars to be much later than Return to Zion. They're considered, Daniel is considered to be a Hellenistic work, a work that is prophesying, quote unquote, the Maccabees. Esther is one big question mark. Of course, many people date Song of Songs late, Shir Shirim, right? Many people date Kohelet late. So you can have books in the Hebrew Bible that academically are dated late. However, it's important to note that in the Hebrew Bible, what you're not going to have is a book that calls itself late that still makes into the Hebrew Bible. In other words, if we think about the books that are big question marks, so the Book of Esther, okay? So the Book of Esther, how much of a question mark it is, I'm not even going to get into. The chronology of it is very difficult to deal with. But the Book of Esther itself places itself quite firmly before the Second Temple period. In other words, it's quite clearly presenting itself as if there's no temple standing, right? Mordechai came out with the Babylonian exiles. Okay, so it's not certainly not after the return to Zion, at least not the way it's presenting itself. Again, the fact that you have it dating itself to Ahasuerus, who we say was Xerxes, so then you've got to have the Second Temple standing. But the problem is that in Esther, there's zero indication that there's a temple standing. There's zero indication that there are Jews in Israel in the way it's presenting itself, and it's clearly presenting itself as coming after the Babylonian exile, because that's Mordechai. You got Mordechai; he came out with the Babylonian exile. His niece is Esther. Another example, Kohelet. Kohelet is connected to Shlomo, to Solomon. So no problem. It's not even close, right? The fact that someone might want to date it later afterwards, academically, any believer is going to connect it to Shlomo Melech, to Solomon. The same thing goes for Song of Songs. It connects itself to Solomon, to Shlomo Melech. So these books are Daniel. Daniel is, again, he's coming out of the Babylonian exile. So you might want to come along afterwards and say, well, actually, this was written during the Hellenistic period. But anyone who believes the book is going to place it before the return to Zion. Now, that's very important because there seems to be a general idea that our final prophets are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And what that means is there's no prophecy afterwards. There's no direct divine inspiration after this period, right? And that's important because there's no Ruach HaKodesh, right? And that's important because there are the what we call the Ketuvim, the writings, these books that don't quite make it into the prophets, but are still super important and are canonized together in the Hebrew Bible, are rather canonical. Well, not canonized. They're canonical. Those books are they have to have been written with divine inspiration, which means they have to be at the latest from the return to Zion. So that's pretty much, you can kind of check them off, right? So Chronicles, Devrei Yamim, that's from the return to Zion. Ezra Nehemiah, return to Zion, right? So Ezra Nehemiah, that's talking about Ezra and Nehemiah and other rulers who dealt with returning to Zion when they were allowed to by Cyrus and by the kings that followed, the Persian kings that followed. But First Maccabees and Second Maccabees, which are also talking about things that the Jews went through and struggles with they don't make it in, right? First and Second Maccabees, they're not in our Bible. Why? Because they're written after some things could be considered truly divinely inspired. That's what in the Hebrew Bible, what it seems to be the rule to get into the Hebrew Bible was it's got to be divine or divinely inspired. So Ben Sira, this is the example I always give, right? Ben Sira, work of Second Temple literature from around 200 BCE. Okay, there's a discussion rabbinically among Chazal in the Talmud about can you read Ben Sira or not, and they're talking about how Ben Sira says things that are similar to the books that did get in. And it becomes clear that they know Ben Sira by heart. Like they're just quoting verses left and right. They know this book backwards and forwards. Well, if this book is so important that they know it by heart, why didn't it make it in? And the answer is because everyone knows when Ben Sira lived. He lived during the Ptolemaic period in Israel, well after the return to Zion. You know it for sure because you know who he was. His grandson was the one who translated into Greek, right? So you couldn't pretend that he's Solomon. You couldn't pretend that he's left during the Babylonian exile. You know when he lived, and he didn't live before the return to Zion. So that's a book that doesn't make it into the Hebrew Bible, even though Chazal are quoting it left and right. They just know it by heart because it's such a great book. It actually, if you read Ben Sira, it reads really nicely as a book that goes right between the Bible and the Mishnah. Now, it fits really nicely into that flow, right? Again, I wouldn't have wanted to be his daughter, but it's most of it. You can really groove on it, and it feels very familiar. If you're steeped at all in kind of the rabbinic tradition and also in the Bible, it feels very familiar when you read Ben Sira. Okay, it's probably the most like that of any of the Second Temple books, at least into my mind. Now, who does keep these books? Who does keep these books that are very clearly written after the return to Zion, and yet they're of value? The Alexandrian Jewish community. The Alexandrian Jewish community keeps these books. Why? I think they just didn't have a stricter rule. From their point of view, I don't think they felt that it had to be divinely inspired. I think that they felt that it had to have good messages. It couldn't be like heretical. It couldn't be like Apikoros. It couldn't be super weird, like Enoch or Jubilees. Okay? Like it couldn't be for a solar calendar, like that wasn't going to go. But if it had good values, it was, and it was seemed important, then they kept it. Book of Tobit, it's got miracles, it's got demons, it's got angels. Like, it's great. I mean, I can really, like, I've said this before, but I can really imagine, like, kicking back on a long winter night and reading the Book of Tobit. Like, that's a fun book. That's a fun book. And it's got good messages, You need to bury your dead, right? You need to do kindness with others, right? You need to pray. Praying is important. Marrying your cousin, good thing, right? So these are things that it kind of proposes, and so that's a reason to keep it. So let's go back to our prophets. So Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are our last book prophets. They're from the return to Zion, and they're considered, so they kind of seal off prophecy for us. What's interesting is that a prophet who might be later than Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi is Yoel. Okay, Yoel, who I mentioned, he's placed between Hosea and Amos because no one really knows when he's from. He's talking about a period, he's clearly speaking in a period where they have a functioning temple, okay, and they are looking back at a destruction and exile of some kind. Of Jerusalem, it seems to be. So it sounds like it's talking kind of about the Second Temple period, but it would have to be early on, and again, who knows? right? So that's kind of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi as our final prophets. Okay. Now, where do they sit vis-a-vis Ezra and Nehemiah? Okay, so if you, I can repost this, but if you look at our Ezra and Nehemiah timeline, okay, so when Cyrus conquers Babylonia in 539, and then pretty much in the first year of Cyrus, it's not really the first year of Cyrus, but first year of Cyrus's rule in this area, okay, he allows the Jews to go back, to rebuild their temple right away. First year of Cyrus, that's in our first year of Cyrus, that's 538 BCE. There's the Aliyah with Shesh Batzar, and they build the altar. Okay, that's in Ezra 3. All right. Now, but then from the first year of Cyrus until the second year of Darius, okay, nothing happens. Okay, second year of Darius, so that's around 18 years. For around 18 years, nothing happens. There's zero progress, it seems like, on the temple. Okay, so they build the altar. They just keep using the altar. They don't build a temple. Okay. Second year of meanwhile, you have Cambuzi in the middle, right? You get to Darius, and in the second year of Darius, they rebuild the temple. That's where our prophets come in. Okay? Our prophets come in when they're like, guys, this isn't right. We're just sitting here. We're not rebuilding. Okay? And so then you have Haggai and Zechariah, not Malachi, he's later. Haggai and Zechariah take it upon themselves to really build everyone up and say, okay, Zerubbabel, who's the governor and also from the Davidic line. He's the Jewish appointed governor by the Persian Empire and also from the Davidic line. They start talking about him in clearly messianic terms. Yoshua, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, only slightly less so. And they're like, okay, this is it. This is the Messianic age. This is it. Now's the time to build the temple. Okay? So, and it seems that partly that might be a certain calculation of the 70 years, Yirmiyahu's 70 years, and that's also kind of egging them on. And what's interesting is, again, when we talk about the connection with Ezra and Nehemiah, so in Ezra and Nehemiah, the reason that's presented, the kind of excuse that's presented for them not building a temple seems to be fear of the nations or fear of people around. They got into a fight early on, and now they're kind of afraid. Now, maybe they're legitimately afraid, but the letters that are brought to kind of back this up in Ezra and Nehemiah are actually all letters that are talking about the wall, and they're talking about things much later. In other words, they're all letters that say why they couldn't build the wall around Jerusalem, not the temple, and they're all dated to later kings. All right? Because that's actually one of the major themes of the book once the temple is built, is getting that wall, right? So getting that wall and really settling the settlement in a way that is correct. And I'm not going to go into that again because we just had a whole class on it. So again, second year of Darius, Haggai and Zechariah are together with Zerubbabel and Yoshua. They're the ones who egg on the building, finally finishing the temple that hasn't been built in ages. They actually get help from Darius because what you see in Ezra and Nehemiah on the flip side is that when Haggai and Zechariah and Zerubbabel and Yoshua are saying, okay, let's build the temple, the governor of the area is like, are they allowed to do this? And he writes to Darius. And meanwhile, he lets them keep building. And he writes to Darius, he's like, Darius, they say that they have permission since Cyrus. Could you check the archives? And he checks the archives, and he's like, yeah, they've got permission. And here, support them clearly. And Darius seems to think that the reason they didn't finish it is because they didn't have enough money. So he supposedly helps them with money. But we really don't, on the flip side, we don't really see that we don't really hear about the support so much that they get really helped by the Persian government to build. We hear about a lot of strife for them and difficulty for them to build, because they are coming out of apparently some kind of drought or famine, and that makes it a very hard time to start using your time and your stuff to build a temple for God, right? And to fund sacrifices. But anyway, so that is Haggai and Zechariah. Now Haggai prophesies. You have exactly dated prophecies. 4 months worth. He prophesied for 4 months. I mean, I'm not saying that he doesn't prophesy afterwards, but we don't have it, right? For 4 months during that year. And again, he's considered instrumental in getting them to build, and he deals with some other issues also. We're going to talk about that too. Zechariah, we have a much longer book. He has some very weird visions, some interesting visions. His famous vision, of course, with the menorah, right? And the olive trees on either side. Like, yes, I know in the symbol we have olive branches, but it's really olive trees on either side of the menorah. And of course, those are for the two anointed people who are going to be the head, Zerubbabel, who's going to be the Davidic king, right? And we're going, who's anointed? The king is anointed, and the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, is anointed. So the one tree, that's why one tree is Zerubbabel and one tree is Yehoshua. Okay, we're also going to talk when we learn Zechariah. We're also going to talk about the apparently problematic nature of Yehoshua. Yehoshua had apparently done something that made people uncomfortable. We'll talk about that also. There's a lot to learn and to talk about, not just the period when we talk about Zechariah, but also how prophecy is kind of developing into things. Now, there's still this idea that you've got the direct word of God. Absolutely, all the prophets, including Malachi, who comes much later than Haggai and Zechariah, they're all frequently speak, God said this to me, this is what God says. But you also see more of this use, particularly in Zechariah really, more of this use of visions, and I saw these angels doing this thing, and I saw these horses, and I saw these. Now, we already see that in Yechezkel. A lot of things that become to kind of typify Second Temple prophecy and later apocalyptic, we already start to see it in Yechezkel. So for these visions and watching angels do stuff and then understanding that, then figuring it out, or having an angel explain things to you, symbolic, different symbols that you see. Of course, this isn't the first time that a prophet sees a symbol, but that and Amos actually also has these visions of symbols that God shows him and then explains to him. But this idea that you have these weird visions that then some angel explains to you, for example, that's something that's very typical, more of the Second Temple period, where you have more of a distance from God. What, you talk to God? God is so talk to the angels. You also have a much more once we've been through the Persian period or into the Persian period, there's much more of an interest in angels. I really do think it's Persian influence. That there's an interest in angels. We have named angels for the first time in Daniel, right? So, like before, okay, yeah, you had some angels, but who the heck cares what name they have? They're not important. They're not important. The important thing is God, and these are his messengers, right? Malach, right? A messenger, right? By the way, in Akkadian, you actually have the verb ilik la'ak, like a lamed aleph kaf, which means to send. So you actually have the verb that malach is like from. But but in this period is when people are much more interested in what are angels doing, things like that. Again, it's not like you didn't see this at all in previous prophets, but it becomes much more prominent, and we really see it in Zechariah. Another thing that we see in Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi is this kind of as this idea of an apocalyptic future, of a future where the wicked are completely destroyed disastrously, and evil is destroyed, and good people make it through unscathed. That's very important. We kind of see, this is something that Yechezkel kind of set up, and I think that because if you think about how prophecies work before there's a Babylonian exile. Now, yeah, I know there's an Assyrian exile, and I know the people from Israel have been exiled, but they don't come back. Those exiles aren't integrated back. We don't know how they continued to see things. We do know how the Babylonian exiles tried to make sense of things, right? We know from Yechezkel, we know from the later works of the Return to Zion. So once you have, when you read, let's say, Yeshayahu, I'm not, put second Isaiah aside, right? But the first half of Yeshayahu, right? Or you read Amos, right? Amos says, why do you want the day of the Lord? It's darkness and not light. Don't you understand you're not just going to escape? No one, when you are all living in the same area, and God says, you've been wicked, I'm going to punish you, the righteous people don't get through unscathed. They're living, it's horrible, right? No one gets through unscathed. Yeshayahu talks about a remnant, not as like, oh, they're all the righteous people. They're the guys who survived. They're the guys who survived. Because some people will survive, but you can't count on surviving once the horrible thing happens, because you're all living together. You're all living in the same area. And if the army attacks, it attacks all of you. It doesn't matter if you're good or bad. Once you've been bad enough as a group, right? You've all got to deal with the punishment as a group. Now, once you get to with Yechezkel's like, no, that's not true. Yechezkel's like, you know what? If you have, and he names three, he wants to say that it's true of the entire world, not just Israel. So he specifically says, he uses the example of Eov, Noach, and Daniel. Now we fix it, the Masorah fix it to Daniel, because who the heck is Daniel? You know who Daniel is, but who's Daniel? Well, Daniel, we know from Ugaritic text, Daniel was like this mythical righteous judge. So Yechezkel's using that. Yechezkel's saying, oh, even if you were this mythical righteous judge, you wouldn't save anyone around you. If you were Noach and Eov and Daniel, and you guys were righteous and everyone else was wicked, the entire everything would be destroyed, and you'd be like three guys standing in the wasteland. Like, that's how it works. Complete individual responsibility. Okay, that's Yechezkel. And I think that what allows Yechezkel to say that is that once you have an exile, once you have an exilic community, and it's connected to a homeland, and it's not that they don't care. They're very connected to the homeland. They really care. People in Babylonia really care what's going on in Jerusalem. And one assumes that for a lot of people, vice versa, right? And yet they know, Babylonian Jews know, that if something happens in Jerusalem, that's not the same as it happening to them. Once you have an exilic community, they don't have the same idea of collective consequences. So they can start talking about, no, only they are getting punished. I'm not getting punished, they're getting punished. And that's when you really start seeing, that's where you really start seeing a vision of an apocalyptic future where the wicked are destroyed in a pinpoint strike. Only the wicked are destroyed, and the righteous go scot-free. And that's what we're going to see in Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, that's the vision of the Messianic future. Now, of course, there's a mix also of how much of a Messianic future is natural, how much of it is supernatural. There's a certain approach that says that as the prophetic books get later, the vision of the future gets more and more supernatural and not natural. We'll discuss that. It's not so clear-cut. We'll see that it's a mix. It's still a mix. And finally, Malachi. So Haggai and Zechariah are the prophets who really egg on them. They get the Jews to finally finish the Second Temple. And they say that Zerubbabel, this is one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit, even though it's really a mystery. They're talking about Zerubbabel finishing it. Zerubbabel is the great white hope, right? He's going to be the Messiah. Let's face it, he's, even in modern Jewish terms, he's the Mashiach, right? That's how they're talking about him, right? And then he disappears, right? We don't hear in Ezra and Nehemiah, when they do the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash, they don't mention Zerubbabel. And the question is, does that mean he disappeared, or does that mean they just don't mention him? Now, it could be they just don't mention him. It could also be that the rulers in Persia were like, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have actually appointed a member of the Davidic dynasty to be the governor of Jerusalem. Maybe that wasn't so smart. And they pulled it back. Or they could have had him killed, right? I don't think they had him killed because I think we would have read about it somewhere. I think someone would have mentioned it. There isn't even an oblique mention of something like that. I think that if anything, they pulled him back to the capital, right? And they said, okay, you've served your term, now come back. And there was just really no way to deal with it, especially since people at the time didn't know what was going to happen. Is he going to come back? Is he going to come back and still be like this Messiah? So we'll talk about that more when we get to it. Finally, Malachi. Okay, Malachi is talking in a different time than Ezra, than Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai and Zechariah, again, we can put them in Darius II, then Zechariah continues, second year of Darius rather, not Darius II, second year of Darius I, and a little later. If we want to place Malachi is talking when there is a functioning temple and people are being skimpy with sacrifices. Okay, they are not supporting the temple the way they're supposed to do it. People are not behaving the way they should. Now, if you want to, it could be at any time. Honestly, you could have a time when everyone was doing the right thing, and then they kind of slipped because they became poor, or things got harder, or they just forgot. You could really place it at pretty much any time in that early period in particular. But if you want to kind of connect it to Ezra Nehemiah is dealing with this, right? Nehemiah's the pledge that's in the book of Nehemiah has them pledging to actually keep up the sacrifices the way they're supposed to. And this is how they're going to keep up the sacrifices. This is how they're going to support the temple, which seems to indicate that they haven't been supporting the temple the way they should. And Nehemiah is still dealing with it afterwards. He serves his term, he goes away, he comes back, and then he still has to deal with this idea of supporting particularly the Leviim, right? So this is a continuous issue. So we might place it, so if we put Nehemiah, if we were talking when we learned Ezra and Nehemiah together, so we were saying that it's very possible that Ezra and Nehemiah are serving under different Artaxerxes, right? So, and it seems from the chronology of Kohanim Gdolim, of high priests, that we see in the book of Nehemiah, that Ezra was actually, that Nehemiah was actually before Ezra. That's in the chronology of their high priests, right? So in that case, we would put Nehemiah and Artaxerxes the first. Artaxerxes the first is 465 to 425. So and so what I'm saying is that Malachi's prophecy fits very nicely into that period, right? So you can say, okay, so Nehemiah is from the 19th, 20th year of Artaxerxes, so it's like 445, 432. Around there. So Malachi could be from that period. He could be from any period, honestly, but with a functioning temple, where there isn't even a question anymore that there's a functioning temple. There's a functioning temple. There are functioning sacrifices. There are functioning priests and Levites. The question is, how are we supporting the temple? What are the sacrifices? Are we bringing the wrong sacrifices? Why is that even a problem? Right? So it's different questions for Malachi. Malachi has a fun rhetorical style, which makes him a lot of fun to read. And of course, in Malachi is where we get the whole idea of Eliyahu Hanavi coming back in the Messianic era. So that's always fun to read and to finish with. So anyway, I am looking forward to your questions. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on, it's either going to be Zoom or, right now I'm just tending towards Zoom because I know Zoom. So I will keep you updated, and I will post the link so that everyone will be ready for our beginning of Haggai on Sunday at 8 on Zoom. And I will send you the link, and looking forward to seeing you there. Take care, be well, and keep safe. Bye-bye.